I'm going to call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
Mr. Chair. A popular call on this side of the House, and I'm sure my colleague Tracy Martin, who was on the Select Committee, will have an excellent contribution to make after I complete mine, along with my colleagues behind me here, Megan Woods, Carol Beaumont. Are you offended, Ian? No, okay. I'll leave you out. Mr. Chair, I want to speak briefly on a couple of the clauses we're dealing with here, both Clause 1 and Clause 3. And I want to start with Clause 3, which is the Principal Act. And I do think in this occasion it's relevant to spend a little bit of time thinking about exactly what it means to be amending the Principal Act in the way that this bill does. And I want to start right at the beginning of the Education Act, which is Clause 3, which is entitled Right to Free Primary and Secondary Education. And it's interesting that the way that the Principal Act defines this, because it actually starts off saying right to free primary and secondary education, except as provided in this Act or the Private Schools Conditional Integration Act 1975, every person who is not an international student is entitled to free enrolment and free education at any state school. And then it carries on around the ages. What this bill does is amend that by including after state school a reference to partnership schools. And I think that's really interesting because the Act says private schools separate. We're going to take private schools out of this, and they're going to have their own legislation to govern this. But what's been done tonight, is a very fundamental change to the Principal Act under Clause 3, which is the Education Act, because it's taking what is a very clear statement there, and I'm not certain, but I'm pretty sure that language in the 1989 Act comes from the original Education Act, the 1877 one or whatever it was, that actually made clear what a state school was. So that's the fundamental change that's been made tonight. We've separated out, Mr. Joyce has obviously great commitment to education over there, interjecting away. Took a little while to get his zoology degree, but that's all right. But the Education Act is now being fundamentally changed. So where previously we have been clear that we are talking about state schools, the state's role in providing the vast majority of the public education in this country, this Act amends that Principal Act and just drops in partnership schools, as the Minister likes to call them, or charter schools, as most people refer to them. That is a fundamental change, and it's hugely disappointing to me, Mr. Chair, that for the vast majority of tonight, we've had no debate from the government side on this. I give the Minister credit that in Part 2, when she was here, she was able to discuss some matters around the OIA, which we disagreed on. But in the earlier part of the debate, we didn't hear from the government why they wanted to make this fundamental change to the Principal Act that we're debating under Clause 3 here. A fundamental change to the New Zealand education system. And Cam Calder has yelled out earlier on that it's only 4 or 5 schools out of 2,000. Dr Calder, we know that the agenda of the ACT Party, who have driven this legislation, is for the widespread privatisation of education. We know that. So it's ridiculous to say it's only 3 or 4 schools. It's a fundamentally different model than we have ever had in the New Zealand education system. Dr. Calder's missing the point here, because that's exactly the point that I'm making, is that in Clause 3 we have that. We've got the integrated school model. We've heard from Ian Lees-Galloway tonight about the kinds of schools that are available under our current model. There's no need for this legislation within the New Zealand system to have that kind of innovative, collaborative response that we all want in terms of education for our children. And so that's the point of highlighting the fact that the Principal Act talks about state schools and provides for integrated schools, provides for private schools, and yet tonight, right alongside state schools, we just say, and those partnership schools. Completely changing the way in which we think of public education in New Zealand, and the government members have barely even debated tonight why that happens. And the problem we have on this side of the House is that the fundamental change is about an ideological experiment that is a result of a political stitch-up between National and the ACT Party, and that has been foisted upon the children of New Zealand and parents who enrol their students in these schools. Mr. Chair?
The honourable member Grant Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Minister said earlier that parents who enrol their children in these schools will be doing so by choice. Well, that's fine. Maybe that is true. Maybe they will be enrolling in. The point is, are they absolutely clear about what these schools are about? Are they absolutely clear that they will not have the right to find out information that is held by the school? And if I had been able to take a call on Part 2, Mr. Chair, and I'll just refer to it very briefly, if I'd been able to take a call on Part 2 in the latter part of that, I wanted to look at a change to the Health Act that no one else has talked about tonight, which is actually to add partnership schools to have the ability to allow nurses to come. That's exactly right. To allow them to become part of a service where nurses go into schools. Now, there's two parts to that. One, that's exactly as Tracy Martin is pointing out, that's a publicly funded service that these private entities will be part of. But two, parents whose children are visited by the nurse won't necessarily be able to find out any information about that. So the Principal Act is being fundamentally amended here, Mr. Chair, and that brings me to the title. And the title of this bill is the Innocuous Education Amendment Bill. That's all it says. Just sounds like we're making a few tweaks here and there. And there are so many other things that this bill could have been called. It could have, honestly, if the Minister wants to call them partnership schools, to do that. I appreciate that it has other matters in it, such as the search requirements that Mr. Hipkins was talking about before, but fundamentally this is about charter schools and other matters. And the charter schools, random interjection from Stephen Joyce, roused himself. It's a pity he didn't decide to take a call and actually stand up and justify to New Zealand why it is that a flawed model like this is being imposed on New Zealand because John Banks and the ACT Party decided that they want it. But instead, Mr. Joyce would rather just chip across the House. Instead, Mr. Joyce, he could stand up and tell us about his great commitment to public education, which is not really in evidence with the funding that he's decided to divert to private tertiary establishments and away from the public system, because that is what this agenda is about. This bill, Mr. Chair, could very easily be called the National Party's privatisation agenda bill, because that is exactly what it is. That is what it is. Stephen Joyce doesn't think it is. That is exactly what this agenda is about. He should actually listen to what the ACT Party has been saying, because at least the ACT Party has been honest about its intentions for the education system. At least it's been honest and said we want to privatise education. I've been on election platforms for 2 elections in a row now with ACT candidates who've been absolutely upfront about their agenda for education, and that is the privatisation. They simply don't believe it is a responsibility of the state to provide that. The National Party is sitting here tonight going along with this mad ideological experiment from John Banks and the ACT Party, and they're happy to do that. The thin end of the wedge, they're happy to see that happen. So the National Party needs to take some ownership of this bill, Mr. Chair, and make sure that their name appears in the title of it. I want to refer to 2 other matters that I believe should be in the title of this bill. The first of those is the question around the non-registration of teachers. The non-registration of teachers should be mentioned, because that is one of the fundamental changes we've had here. And the Ministry of Education officials who tried to advise the government that actually having unregistered teachers would lower the quality of education were ignored by this government. And that should be mentioned in the title of this bill, because going against the advice of the experts and going in favour of John Banks and his merry but very small band of ACT people defies belief, Mr. Chair, that we would have a situation where educational policy and a significant matter of whether or not we think all the students in New Zealand deserve to have trained and registered teachers in front of them. And tonight, the National Government makes a fundamental change to what we expect from government about when they're talking about education. Mr Joyce is bored with talking about whether or not it's important to have trained teachers in front of classrooms. He doesn't care whether or not students are safe in their classrooms, because that is the end point, Mr Joyce. Mr Joyce does not care if the students in charter schools are safe, because without registered teachers in front of classrooms, we simply won't. And he interjects on and on. If only he'd take a call and justify for this, because he cannot do that. We deserve, all the students in New Zealand deserve to have registered teachers. This bill is a sham.
I call the honourable member Tracy Martin.
Talofa, Mr.